apologies for the delay in just getting things started, but I think we've got probably a pretty good group mass forming, so I think we can get kicked off. So for today's agenda on the governance call, we've got a number of topics actually. I think that we can work through. Some of them I think will probably be quicker than others. On our last profiling call, we got very, very close to a motion to remove one of the profiles that really just hasn't met our governance criteria in the past for why we have CA baseline profiles to begin with, and what their intent is and our process for maturing them. But we were at the very top of the hour before like a motion was raised. And so we said, even though we were getting some regrets from folks not able to attend today, we'd bring it forward again to see if there is someone willing to, or a number of folks if we're willing to kind of pursue the proposed motion. So I'll give some framing of that in a few minutes. But in addition to that, I think at the top of the hour in our last profiling call, we also had this kind of topic around what we should do from a baseline perspective around kind of managing our list, whether it be like the list of established profiles or the list of ones that we might consider adding in as new profiles are introduced, like for example, through PCH DCF and CA Core. So thinking from a governance perspective on like, what should our process be if we see that there are net new profiles in the community that we hadn't previously had on our list of the baseline in the past. I also was hoping to get around to kind of framing some of our outstanding kind of actions that are necessary before we can get the version 1.2 out, that either are, waiting on decisions or they're ready to be applied or they're going to be kind of put forward for future decisioning in a later version. And then I've got this last item. We've kind of been talking about this one in the governance for a while now. It's linked to this one, which is like, how do we know when a profile that kind of was on our list because it was there 4 years ago is the right one to keep on the list as we get to later maturities and realize maybe some folks aren't using some of the profiles as much as they are using others. So that's kind of like the final continuing topic that we have on our governance agendas. I wanted to pause here before we kick off on any of these items. Was there anything that you folks would want to make sure I didn't touch on that we prioritize for today? Like somewhere in this list? All right, cool. All right, then I will give a recap. I see some folks that might not have been on the Friday call last Friday, so I'm going to just zoom in. So the framing of this first one that we think is probably ready for a motion. We didn't hear any concerns on the profiling team for this approach, but we did want to bring it to governance. The framing is that we have a profile on goal. And that profile, while it has gone through the kind of initial development through our process 4 years ago, where we started with a list of kind of what was present in the US core and then tried to apply Canadian constraints where they were applicable to that list. Goal was one of them that largely hasn't progressed in any way since the initial kind of introduction. And so unlike some of its other counterparts that even have, where's the goals, that even have like some due diligence that's been performed on them and examples of this profile that's in use in other Canadian implementation guides, Goal was one that just really, like when we go down the list, didn't really have either Canadian context that we had specifically placed on that was distinct from US core, or any equivalents in the Canadian space, even now, 4 years later, that we could find in the registry, that would kind of guide us towards the belief that this is in use. There might be things that are Canadian in nature, and there is value for us to putting forward a profile at this time for it. We, in thinking through our options, And just to frame a little bit of this, so originally we kind of came to the conclusion of maybe we should remove the goal profile because we were talking about the issues that we have on the goal profile today and how we might want to resolve them while minimizing disruption and like minimizing lack of harmonization with like what we're seeing in other national cores. And we kind of arrived at this discussion point of like, is this kind of option 4, which is removal of the profile itself, maybe the best way forward that doesn't have necessarily a ton of cons to it compared to potentially the risk of like changing things about it, even though we aren't necessarily like rooted in those changes being Canadian in nature. And so we know as part of that discussion, the other component is like, regardless of whether or not we choose to remove goal or keep it, that some of the options that we discussed from a profiling mechanism standpoint last session, like we still have to have a pattern in place and probably some criteria on, how we would want to implement these options in other profiles moving forward. But my consensus, or I should say, but my summary, and I'll let others, weigh in on theirs as well, was that at least for this, like considering the criteria against this particular profile, there weren't a lot of folks that were arguing for us to keep it. And so where we left off was specifically wanting to see if there was anyone that was willing to bring this forward. Lorraine started to raise the motion at the last session, but we ran out of time and she wasn't able to attend this one. So if there's anyone that after either participating last time or in hearing some of the framing this time that is interested in raising this, or if we think we need further discussion on it, we wanted to open up the time on today's call to do so. Is there anything I missed? Like, I know a lot of folks were on the call last Friday. Like, did I miscategorize anything or miss any major areas of discussion that inform the group's feelings towards this?
No, that fits with my recollection of the discussions.
For folks that maybe weren't, because I know we did a call for like, hey, is there anything else we have to discuss on this item? Quite a bit last session. For folks that are new to this topic at this session, are there other things that you would want to make sure you understand or that you discuss before you'd feel comfortable being like, yeah, this makes sense, let's move forward with it from a governance perspective if the profiling team is comfortable with it? And if the answer to that is no, does anyone want to put forward the formal motion about what we should do in terms of goal?
I'll make the motion to remove the goal from baseline.
Okay. Any edits to this before we ask for a seconder? Anyone interested in seconding this motion?
I will.
Okay. Do we feel that we need any further discussion before calling for a vote? All right. Is there anyone that wants to abstain on a vote towards like removing goal from the CA baseline?
Eridan, this is Mukesh. So I'm not sure. I haven't attended the last couple of the meetings. So what was Lorraine's comment on this one, if you remember or no?
So Lorraine was saying, like, was the original motioner before we could call for a vote last profile to specifically remove the goal profile from our established profile list in the baseline.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, then we're good.
So I'll call back to, is there anyone that wants to abstain from the vote? Is there anyone that wants to vote negative on this motion? All right, the vote carries, the motion carries. 12-0-0. Beautiful. Okay. So we will remove goal from the list. I think it's following a very similar pattern as what we kind of saw and decided in terms of smoking status. That the maturity level will kind of drive our next steps in terms of which version to remove it from and any of the kind of surrounding communication around it. Which brings us, I think, to almost like the inverse of this exercise, which is we've been talking a lot about, well, you know, as we prepare for this next level of maturity of the guide, like, can we trim the fat on things that like just really haven't gotten engagement and that we haven't had expertise provide feedback on, and we just haven't been able to mature these profiles, but we had them in our list. I think the next topic, which is around like profile list management, is also kind of like the inverse, which is we've never really talked about how things might get introduced as new profiles, because we just started with this original list from US Core and we've not really added anything since then. And I think Thomas, I don't know if I'm miscategorizing kind of your ask from last time, but I think, you know, within this topic, I think the idea was trying to discuss what happens in relation to the Pan-Canadian Health Data Content Framework, CACDI and CORE. If, for instance, we see things that get scoped in that we don't have a baseline profile for, like, should we consider adding it? What are the implications of that? Vice versa. Because I think we know, and we've kind of talked about the fact that like naturally because we've been around for 4 or 5 years, we have things that are not going to make the first cut of CACDI and CA Core, and that's normal. It doesn't mean we have to remove them. It's the reverse, I think, that we just really haven't ever talked about a process for. So like, what are folks' immediate thoughts on this? I mean, has this been raking your brain as well of like, we should be adding to, let me see if I can pull up that list again, of when and what we should add to this kind of this list? Obviously, it's pretty extensive. So even with the removal of some things like goal and smoking status, like it may be a while till we actually have to like consider this. But if folks are looking to try to like put some, you know, process in place of like, when do we consider adding additional profiles? We can also use that if, for instance, we got requests from the community to profile on something. Quiet crowd. Thomas, I think this was something that you had originally raised, right? Or maybe I paraphrased it wrong and I missed the mark.
If I recall correctly, last time what I would like to reference is the Pan-Canadian Health Data Content Framework, which is the superset
Yeah.
of a CACDI, because CACDI has its own counterpart in the FHIR standard already that we decided already, which has given the name CA Core or Plus. Originally, I thought we have a very comprehensive discussion already regarding the relationship between the baseline and the CA Core, CA Plus, CA Core Plus, whatever. And if we go back to reference the US model, which is a community driven and which is government driven, the manner, whatever, agent driven, and they have ONC They have a US core, and they have, I think it's the name of the project called Argonaut. I cannot remember. That's actually driven by the community, but still have this kind of played a little bit of competition game with USCDI, US core. My thought maybe that 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 pattern can be introduced in Canada, which we do not compete with the USCDI, which is CA Core or CA Core Plus, but we might think to utilize this Pan-Canadian Health Data Content Framework, which is superset, and to have the base to review and revise the baseline and also have this friendly relationship with the CA core in that manner.
So Thomas, am I hearing like, because there's core profiles that are established over the subset of information in PCH DCF that are CACDI, that you're asking around like, what is the relationship specifically we should be considering between the baseline and PCH DCF, particularly about like introduction of new profiles?
I'm sorry, I just got us just recover from the SIGME, but I didn't clarify clear. My mind is a little muddy. Sorry. In that way, from Kahai side, they have a PCH DCF versus CACDI, which is superset versus the subset, and which is their counterpart in the FHIR standard. For the CACDI, we do have a CA core right now. So can we set up our baseline as a counterpart of PCHDCF? So you can see the relation between the data part can be reflected in the FHIR standard data domain right now, which is the PCHDCF versus CACDI in that data domain, but in the FHIR standard domain, we have baseline versus CA core.
So the thing that's, can you give more insight, Thomas, into the thing, like the driver behind the ask? Is it because you're trying to understand if you're looking at beyond just the CACDI and you're looking at the materials that are part of the PCH DCF, you're trying to understand like how some of those are going to be modeled in FHIR, but we may not have those answers in the core yet?
Yes,
Okay.
you're right. Actually, this is where the challenge comes from, because right now, my understanding, at least from all those given meetings or webinars from Sky High side, they all focus on the CACDI right now, that logical model which is given about the immunization. And also, yes, but from my understanding, we might not be able, or we don't want to be the competitor of the CA core working group, right? In that manner, what we can take and let InfoWay or Kai to drive that CACDI talk and as well as the CA core work, and the baseline will go through that Canadian data framework, which might have some challenges there, but we might think that's the opportunity there. I know there's quite lots of unknown there, but we could say, okay, this is something we can think about the utilize their data set as a foundation to build upon baseline in the future instead of we still lingering to some use case oriented or uncertainty here.
Got it. Okay. So it's less about these questions, right? And because it's not so much about the things that already have profiles and more around like, what are the pros and cons if we were to look at the things that necessarily haven't been modeled in FHIR yet? So what are the pros and cons of that? There's a couple considerations. but go ahead. Sorry, was someone speaking? So one complexity, I think, to this question is, and maybe it's a con, maybe it's a pro, is how do we make sure that we would stay, that like as modelers, while many of us obviously like are well integrated across a variety of streams of work, how would we ensure, is there anything that we can like learn from other nations that made sure that what was the kind of grassroots developed product doesn't actually end up conflicting with the essentially the modeling that we would see present in CACDI and of CACDI through CA Core. I think the biggest con would be figuring out how we prevent that from happening, where we would make decisions that would be different or that would have to be maintained over time, that drove disharmony with core. Is that, do folks see that as like a reality, or is that like a sky is falling potential?
I see it as a reality. Stepping back a little bit, the PCH DCF and CACDI are targeting, if not particular use cases, then particular environments. And I think we had said we want to be more use case agnostic. I think, you know, the official profiles and official implementation guides that vendors are going to be asked to conform to is CA Core Plus, CA Core. And so I think the role of CA Baseline is to address broader issues that aren't necessarily included in CACDI and PCH DCF. Oh, that's just a lovely set of letters. So it's beyond the scope that they're thinking of for them, and it should be, CA Baseline should be the largest set of use cases, or completely use case agnostic, but still for which we feel that there is some level of need for Canadian alignment. So I would say that yes, where CA Core says something that is contrary to what we've said, we should look at relaxing or aligning with them. But I don't know that we should aim to, sort of CACDA or CA Core Plus. CA Core is focused on this part of the Pan-Canadian data standards. I expect over time it will expand to include more of it, and I expect Hi will also expand Pan-Canadian data standards to include more. So both of those will keep growing. So I don't know that baseline should try and cover the parts of the framework that isn't currently in CA Core Plus, because that will be, I expect, will be a constantly moving target. I think what we should be looking at is some broader guidelines to sort of support what is going on there, and to address, address those needs outside of the scope of the framework.
Let me know if I'm typing anything that you think needs to be rephrased.
You're gonna actually make me think about what I just said.
I think I have the harder job, which is to try to make it fit in a slide. Okay, so basically like this idea of, by the nature of what baseline is intended to be, which is use case agnostic, that given that PCH, DCF, and CACDI also have this kind of minimal primary care lens, that might be one consideration, to not try to do this kind of one-to-one. And then the second one being like, what is in scope right now for modeling may be time dependent and is expected to, like, that would be something that changes over time. So it may not be efficient to say, well, whatever, we'll look at the things that are in PCH, DCF that aren't in CACDI right now. So like on two, am I right? Like on like two logical fronts, Elliot, you're saying like, this might be the reason why we don't draw a parallel one-to-one with PCH, DCF.
That would be my thought, yeah.
Are there any kind of counter arguments to that or other considerations?
Can I just share a little bit?
Mhm.
Well, I do agree with Elliot from technical perspective. Actually, this is what I observed, understanding right now about the, I call it some issues about the FHIR standard, which is from technical perspective, they offer the whole universe to the business you know area, which is sometimes overwhelmed the manner. And let's come back here. Technical is important, but it need to build upon the market and the demand, especially in Canada right now, the health sector, especially we call the universal health program in Canada, being driven and being provided by each PD jurisdiction, which is government in that term. And from CAHI side, we have these two related data set, PCHDCF and the CACDI. They're all, evolving, and they are data standard in Canada right now. And in the manner, if we don't try the way to align either of them, and as we all know that, Ellie, you have said already, the standard, the counterpart in the FHIR standard is coming, is evolving, and eventually it will be the true, how to say, whatever, de facto standard or real standard with those authority, and might be the replacement of this baseline work. That's my worry about. Thank you. You the back.
So Thomas, some of them, so I think what I'm hearing is like, regardless of what happens with like core having this evolving list, that there is a reality on the ground that people are saying, this is going to become a de facto standard. And we need answers on how to prepare for it. Is that what you're saying?
What I mean actually is there are data standard in Canada already, which is the superset and subset from data standard perspective. And now they have a CA core is in under development, which will be the CACDI counterpart in the FHIR standard. And as Elliot mentioned, Will Gray, the FHIR, the counterpart in FHIR standard for this PCH DCF will come. That's no doubt. If we don't take this opportunity, some other, I don't know, organization, the Kai Hai Way included, they will take it. And all those FHIR standard based PCH, DCF, CACDI eventually will take over all those, I would say, the space, not matter from technical perspective, but from marketing perspective in Canada of the baseline work. That's no doubt.
Okay, I'll play devil's advocate on this one a little bit, Thomas. So let's say, so I think I have to modify this because I think maybe your point is maybe more that like your concern is that the baseline will be replaced.
Yep.
Okay.
If we don't follow and take an opportunity to move forward, definitely I do agree with Alex. We don't need to 100% stay with PCHDCF, but that will be the kind of base model for baseline to move forward. If we don't follow this, direction, we might eventually be, unfortunately, to be removed from, FHIR IG world, community in Canada.
So the counter argument that I will make to that is that, at least in my mind, the baseline has a goal of harmonizing authors around how we model particular Canadian concepts. And that there was always a world that I thought could happen where eventually that would happen, and the underlying profiles that we had in the baseline therefore became obsolete. But that wouldn't be a bad outcome. That would mean that our goal of achieving harmonization and how we accomplish these things in Canada would have been accomplished. So whether or not it's a grassroots or like when we originally were talking about like grassroots plus jurisdictional kind of enforced, or effectively resourced and staffed and maintained, regardless of its operating model, if the underlying philosophy of the baseline is still maintained and we still have accomplished harmonization of the Canadian contextual requirements across our guides, that isn't a bad thing. The bad thing would be if this became a de facto standard and we didn't proactively align to it. And I think if we disagreed with it, if we couldn't stay up to date, if we directly conflicted with it, if we drove disharmony, that I think is the worst outcome than us being replaced. Does that make sense to folks?
We need more interaction, not from this side to drive to harmonize with other existing ongoing FHIR IG, but also need other projects in Canada, especially try to consider baseline as their one alternative. And with this coming standard, data standard, and the counterpart, I would see the opportunity window is closing if we do not catch up this opportunity.
So like basically like having to find that sweet spot. where there is this value that we're providing, but it isn't
Yes.
being done in conflict or disharmony.
Yeah, just my understanding about health sector is this is government-driven business. Anything relevant to health sector always need some authority. The data is also included.
What do folks like, what initial reactions, I mean, to both, or I guess all three of these points? Do people share the same types of like outlooks towards this of like what your highest degree of concern is around?
I think my personal perspective is I think like there is definitely room for both like baseline and core, because they are addressing, two very separate needs, as we've kind of mentioned on the call. And we've seen, Australia also has a similar model where they have a separate base and a separate core that are, handling, different aspects of conformance and reprofiling and all that. So like they serve different purposes. Um, and definitely, there's going to be alignment between CA core and CA CDI. I think the framework is quite encompassing. Um, and we know that in the development of the initial US core, like it was very much grassroots first on, what do we need for exchange rather than going from a modeling um, the healthcare environment perspective. So yeah, like I don't know that trying to map baseline directly to the framework will be easy, um, or that it'll be immediately practical for now. But I'm happy to also hear other thoughts too. Like I'm always wary of trying to, boil the ocean, as they say, trying to
Mhm.
take on a perfect solution. While we have, probably more immediate needs.
So do you see CA core as, or do you see CA baseline as sort of the um, scouts running out in front of CA core, doing the investigation, doing the getting a feeling, the ground, the basic research that CA core can then solidify? Or do you see separate needs, separate directions for them?
I think I see them separate, but only in the sense that there's going to be stuff that is, Canadian context, um, that maybe doesn't belong in the core, right? That it's not going to be a consistently required element across all specs, which is, what the CA core is planned to be kind of the there's going to be stuff that e-referral, e-consult is not going to be able to provide as an example. And So we wouldn't want to have that in the core, but maybe that is guidance we definitely want to have as part of the baseline to say that, hey, if you work in Canada and you do plan to interact with our health system, we know that this is the kind of like guidance we want people to take, so that everyone's kind of using the same bindings when they are using those elements or those profiles, but not necessarily have that as part of a core, if that makes sense. Like there's going to be extensions, for example, that are very appropriate for a lot of use cases, but not in every use case.
Okay, so kind of actually I think there's like maybe 3 axes to this. That is, so I think that kind of well, actually, no, now that I'm thinking about it, like when we said, okay, we're going to socialize extensions that we know are present in at least more than just one guide, that kind of put the baseline closer to like this, the Australian approach, right? Which is like, these are things that we think are common, but not common enough that they're going to like have an inheritance pattern where everybody has to utilize them in some way. Whereas I think this one would be like, if we didn't, for example, if in our medication profile, we didn't have, or a medication statement profile, we didn't like include extensions that were e-prescribing specific. Like we said, well, that's not used in every use case, and so it's not going to be in the baseline. And so I think we're actually much closer to this today, right? We'll socialize, like we socialize extensions that we're starting to see are common, structures that we're starting to see are common, but we acknowledge that that doesn't mean that you have to use that structure if it doesn't make sense for your need. But I think that potentially this is just another way of viewing, like, so baseline is Scout, I think is what Thomas was kind of referring to. Whereas I think that Elliot, I think you were saying our sweet spot is in this kind of highest level, which I think is closer to this, right? This or this, one of the two.
I really wish that we can stay at the highest level, but we do need authority. And so far, I haven't seen any government or their arm length agent could give us that privilege.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's something that like we need to chew on more. The more that we've talked, the more I kind of think that like these are not diametrically opposed statements. It's more just about like where people are pinning their like what we think our sweet spot is. But I don't know how we come to a conclusion about, this is where we'll continue moving forward. I think maybe one thing that might help, maybe at a future governance call, like maybe we look at the Australia base and how it compares to Australia core, and see if that helps kind of flavor our thinking on this topic. Because my original thinking was that like this would be a little bit more like process based around inclusion of new profiles, but I think that this is a broader discussion that probably would merit a number of sessions. Are there other things that folks would want to like explore in this space to help us arrive at like some conclusion around which of these that we think feels most natural for us?
I think looking at the Australian example, and not necessarily really looking at the technical content, but more, how they're positioning it and what they're trying to achieve. I think that will give us some indication of, what's the direction that we could be heading. So that would certainly be helpful. I don't know if that's necessary, but not sufficient.
Yep. I think that the good news is like none of this, like we have time, right? So it's not like we have to like rush a decision on any of this because we also know like the variables that are at play are also changing. So I think the more that we can inform ourselves and try to shape an opinion in a reasonable manner, the better off we'll be. So I'll mark this down. If other people have other ideas of like how else might we probe this space, happy to hear them, throw them out on the forums, email them. We can talk about them at future sessions as well. Well, I'm going to kind of keep the pin in it. I wanted to be respectful of like the topic because Thomas, I know you said you were like, you want to talk about it, but it's probably something that we can't drive to a conclusion on in this session. But I think that we're better for our ability to be able to like talk about what some of our options as we understand them today are. So I'll note that on a future, maybe even the next governance session that we have for an agenda item. We've got about 9 minutes then on this front. I think the only thing I didn't get a chance to, let me just make sure where I'm at in the agenda. Frame outstanding asks. Okay, this is just more of a heads up. Goal right now is this is a heads up, sorry, I'm mentally jumping tracks here. So taking us from kind of way future state back to, okay, immediate pressing kind of like what's happening in the next couple of months. We have been pushing for version 1.2 for a while. We also have been through the governance pushing a lot of like the decisions that are going to help us in 2.0. In order for us to get to 1.2 before the break in December, I thought it might be helpful to kind of highlight where we sit with our tickets, because we don't necessarily have to have all of our tickets resolved and applied in order to publish in 1.2. And we also don't need to have all of our tickets resolved and applied in 2.0 if some of them are like future considerations. So what I've done is I've taken the issue log that we have on FHIR and I've just kind of like categorized this for folks for your awareness. There are two, like typically with our statuses, submitted is like, hey, this has come in, but we haven't dedicated any time on sessions to talk about it. Triaged these are the things that like we are directly talking about on calls. So the one that made this category was the goal issue. Ready to be applied, these are things that like we have motions on. These had decisions, or if they were like, I don't think we have any in this round, but if they were like bug fixes where it's like, oh, correct this sentence, which has a spelling error that didn't necessarily need a motion, like that might be a ready to be applied one. And then we've got this broader bucket called awaiting community feedback. We had a bucket for a while and we still do, we just never really used it, which was like awaiting I think it's like awaiting input from feedback provider. This is what I would consider almost more like, these are the items in looking at them, because they are largely around referencing like, oh, this terminology might change in the future depending on what comes out in CACDI. Or, this is something that is out of date in this value set, but it's not something that we maintain. I am kind of considering these are things that we may not even like have control over for a 2.0. So want to get folks' thoughts on like comfortability with this as a bucket where it's like, even if we have some things in this awaiting community feedback, there may be things that we can't resolve or that we can't resolve right now. but that it shouldn't necessarily hold us back from ability to publish for 2.0. There were technically 2 asks that we had discussed, basically like on the sessions. So I think one was an ask for tightening of an expectation, like and one was an ask for, actually they might have both been asks for tightening expectations. Let me see. That we discussed considerably on the baseline, and then we came to the conclusion that, like, based on our current principles, we couldn't tighten it as is, but we wanted to explicitly ask the community if they had further, like, if we could get further evidence that this was like absolutely necessary, really important, that we might reconsider it. So the one that I'm thinking about right now, I think is like in procedure. So like we obviously had considerable discussion. We said basically like we'd like to hear from broader like communities before we would essentially like make any major change to the binding strength on this procedure code. So but largely I would say the majority of these are like racialized group value set that we point to is out of date. And so like there are some things that like, you know, we will we can kind of raise and monitor, but that we don't have direct control over. Does it make sense for like that as the status grouping for some of those types of things, like, or even like ethnicity extension enhancements? Like these were things that like aren't necessarily our extensions, or that may be impacted by how ethnicity is modeled in CACDI and CA core, that if we like try to just fix the ticket and jump to a conclusion and make that change, that it may not actually be good timing for it. But we can also classify these in other kind of statuses if folks are uncomfortable with this idea of like, this is kind of more like our icebox, or things that we're monitoring and asking for feedback on, but not considering needing to have to be addressed before 1.2 or 2.0. That seem reasonable to folks? Are there ones that like people would be less comfortable with? Like this one was one where it was like, we tried really, really hard to get a code that was brought up in the community incorporated into the HL7 value set, and we were told on 3 occasions that the answer was no. So there might just be some where it's like, if we still feel like we want to keep this on the back burner, we certainly can. We can always try to raise this issue again, but I just want to make sure that we're working through the things that we do have the ability to change. From a governance perspective, is anyone concerned if these are things that don't get addressed in 2.0?
Well, I think some of them could be addressed in 2.0. I don't know that they're like, remind me, we're gonna do a, what release are we moving towards?
1.2, and that's what we're attempting before January, and then 2.0
Yeah.
would be post January, but it's like all of the canonical changes. So, you know.
Right. So 1.2, I wouldn't worry about those things. For 2.0, depending on how quickly we move, then perhaps some of these we could, you know, get that community feedback, get additional discussion on them. It might be useful to see if there are any there that we can close out, but I
Okay.
wouldn't hold things up on it.
So maybe as a like an activity between 1.2, because I mean really we're trying to get through 1.2. And 2.0, one of the things that we do is we just look at all of the tickets that are in this and make decisions about whether or not we want to, how we would want to act on them.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, and then like this one is probably falling in that same category too. Cool. Okay. I think we could do that. And then these were just, this was more or less for the profiling call, but to identify that the tickets that we do have, there's like 9. I kind of rank them in maybe easiest to more verbose or more complex changes. But ultimately, like, these aren't difficult ones to do. If there are volunteers that want to put in a pull request with any of these changes, each one of these tickets has a clear, this is the action item, this is the change. So they're all set up in such a way that you could pick them up in 15 minutes on a lunch break, for example. So call out for volunteers if anyone has any availability and notably wants to be noted as an editor in our contributors page as opposed to a contributor. All it takes is one change request.
Sheridan, this is Mukesh. So I think in past also I did mention I can volunteer, but I need assistance first time because I haven't done anything on this side. So if someone can do one-to-one with me once, then in future I can take care for some.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah. And I'm happy to, we've done a couple one-on-ones in the past to like show people, here's how you set up your environment. Would there be anyone else that wants to get that at the same time?
Yeah, this is Piers. I could do with a refresher.
Okay. Awesome. Okay.
Now, the last time we did it on a call, did we record it?
I know we've recorded it on a baseline call. We've done a few one-on-ones that we didn't record, but I know it's somewhere on YouTube, Elliot, if you want to take a look at the playlist. I know in one of the uploaded recordings, we do have a starting point where we talked about like, here's how you create a branch that you make your change in. I just don't know if it'll be like distinctly called out,
Okay.
but it is there somewhere.
I'm just thinking people want to get started before we have time to get something organized.
It might have been labeled. I don't know. Like if it would be wonderful if you could just have a quick scan through it. My guess is that it's more than a year old and that it would be a profiling call.
Yeah.
It might have some additional content in the like the written description, but that's usually what we'll do for special sessions is like we'll sometimes like have a little bit of a briefing on this was a special session on this. Otherwise, I think Mukesh, Piers, I'll probably connect with you guys over email and see if we can get a time before the break to walk you through the process and if we can record that one too.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Well, on that note, I will pause our recording and I will see many of you folks next Friday.
Right. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks
you.
much.
Bye.
Cheers.
you.